Welcome to Life Stories. Love is not just about what we see, it's about what we feel, what we understand, and the connections that go beyond the surface. Today's story is a journey of resilience, healing, and a love that sees beyond darkness. It's about a woman who has learned to navigate the world without sight and a man who has spent his life shielding himself from emotions. When their paths cross, everything changes. Will love be enough to bridge the gap between fear and trust? Stay with us to find out. Subscribe now to Life Stories and let's begin today's story. I remember the day I understood what it meant to be invisible. Not in the literal sense, of course. I had been blind since birth. But the darkness I lived in wasn't the absence of sight, it was the absence of warmth. The realization that I was merely passing through a world that had never truly seen me. My name is Emma, and for as long as I can remember, I have been alone. I was abandoned as a baby, left at the doorstep of a shelter with nothing but a thin blanket and a name scrawled on a piece of paper. No parents, no family, no explanation. The system raised me, but no one ever really kept me. People often pity blind children, but pity doesn't replace love. Pity doesn't hold you when you cry at night, wondering why you weren't enough for someone to stay. The closest thing I had to a family was Margaret. She was an older woman who took me in when I was barely a teenager. She wasn't perfect, her body was frail, and her voice carried the exhaustion of someone who had seen too much of life, but she was kind. And kindness, I learned, was rare. She gave me a place to stay, helped me navigate the world, and taught me how to rely on my other senses when sight was not an option. But even that fragile comfort was slipping away. Margaret was getting older, and I could hear it in the way she breathed, in the tremor in her hands when she gripped mine. "You can't keep going on like this," she murmured one morning, her voice lined with worry as I prepared for work. I forced a smile. "I'll be fine, Margaret," she sighed, and I reached out, tracing the lines of her face with my fingers. I knew what she wanted to say but didn't. That she was afraid for me. That she knew she wouldn't always be here. But what could I say? That I was afraid too? That every step I took felt like walking toward an inevitable loneliness? Instead, I gripped my cane tightly and walked out the door. The city was alive that morning, its sounds and scents guiding me like an old melody. The distant hum of passing cars, the hurried footsteps of people lost in their own routines, the laughter of a couple as they walked by. All of it formed the rhythm of the world I had memorized. At the edge of the curb, I felt the vibrations of an approaching train beneath my feet. I counted my steps, waiting for the right moment to cross. To anyone watching, I was just another face in the crowd. But I knew better. People either looked at me with pity or indifference, and neither one made me feel truly seen. The only place where I felt remotely useful was Whitmore Books, a small, tucked-away bookstore that smelled of ink and aged paper. Here, time moved slower, and the weight of the world felt lighter. "You're early as always, Emma," called Mr. Whitmore, the store's gruff but well-meaning owner. "Routine is important," I replied softly, my fingers brushing along the spines of books as I made my way to my usual spot. "Besides, books are the only friends that never leave." He chuckled. "That's a sad way to look at life. Girl, you deserve more than just books." I wished I could believe that. While I loved the feel of pages beneath my fingertips, the way words painted entire worlds in my mind, I knew books could never truly replace what was missing. They couldn't hold me when I was afraid. They couldn't whisper reassurances when doubt crept into my heart. But I had learned long ago not to hope for things beyond my reach. "Books are enough," I murmured. Even as I said it, a small voice inside me whispered, "What if there was more?" But reality had a way of reminding me where I stood. I was a blind woman in a world that valued sight. And in that world, people like me didn't get fairy tale endings. I had accepted that a long time ago. People hesitated before speaking to me, unsure of how to act. They whispered as if blindness made my hearing weaker instead of sharper. They assumed my life was a tragedy. But I didn't mourn what I had never known. I had never seen the sky. But I had felt the sun's warmth on my skin. I had never gazed upon flowers. But I had inhaled their delicate fragrance. My world was built on sound, touch, and memory, and to me, it was as vivid as any painting. Still, I couldn't deny the loneliness that came with it. Every day, I moved through a world where people either pitied or ignored me. And I had learned to keep my head high and walk forward despite it. I was used to the stares, the murmurs about the poor blind girl. But none of them knew the fire that burned inside me. None of them knew how much I longed to be more than just a girl defined by what she lacked. "Do you ever wish you could see?" Margaret had once asked me. It was a question I rarely answered. I had only smiled and said, "No, Margaret, I just wish people didn't think I needed to." But deep down, I sometimes wondered, not about sight, but about something more, a connection, someone who would see me, not as a woman defined by her blindness, but as a person with a heart that longed to be understood. Routine had always been my anchor. It was the thing that kept me steady when the world around me felt uncertain. At Whitmore Books, I knew every shelf, every title, every worn-out cover. I had memorized the way the scent of books changed in different parts of the store. Some corners carried the musty scent of forgotten classics, while others smelled of freshly printed pages. I took comfort in these little details because they reminded me that, in some small way, I belonged here. But the world outside the bookstore was less forgiving. Most customers hesitated to ask for my help, unsure if I was capable. I had learned to recognize the doubt in their voices before they even spoke. It was always the same, uncertainty, followed by awkwardness. "Excuse me, miss." A man's voice interrupted my thoughts one afternoon. His tone was hesitant, unsure. "I'm looking for a book. But I don't know if you..." I cut him off gently, but firmly. "What's the title?" There was a pause before he cleared his throat. "The Silent Ones" by Margaret Rowe. Without hesitation, I turned, running my fingers along the familiar spines of books until I reached the exact section. My fingertips traced the raised letters on the cover before I pulled it from the shelf and handed it to him. "Here," I said, tilting my head slightly. "It's a mystery novel about a woman who uncovers secrets hidden in silence." The man took the book, his surprise evident in the slight delay of his response. "You knew exactly where it was," he murmured, almost in awe. I only smiled. "I know this store better than anyone." He muttered something under his breath, something about how remarkable that was, but I had stopped listening. I didn't need his validation. I knew my worth. And yet, no matter how much I tried to convince myself otherwise, there was still an ache in my heart. Because proving people wrong wasn't the same as being truly seen. That night, as I made my way home, the air was crisp, the city lights humming softly in the distance. I took careful steps, listening to the rhythm of the streets, feeling the vibrations beneath my feet. But as I reached the curb, something felt off. The traffic was lighter than usual, the city quieter, and then, the roar of an engine, the sudden screech of tires against wet asphalt. And before I could react, something heavy slammed into me. The world spun. My cane was ripped from my grasp. My body crumpled onto the pavement. Pain, a sharp, searing pain shot through my limbs, followed by a strange, terrifying weightlessness. And then, nothing. Somewhere in the distance, I heard footsteps, a voice, low and urgent, breaking through the haze of pain and disorientation. "Miss, can you hear me?" I wanted to answer. I wanted to move, but the darkness that had always been my companion swallowed me whole. The first thing I became aware of was warmth. A steady, unfamiliar heat pressed against my skin. Strong hands lifting me from the cold pavement. My body ached in ways I had never known before, sharp pain radiating from my ribs. A dull throbbing in my skull. The air smelled of rain and asphalt, of something rich and expensive. Then, the voice again, deep, controlled, though laced with something I couldn't quite name. "You're going to be okay." I wanted to scoff. How could he possibly know that? But my lips wouldn't move. My limbs felt disconnected from me. My body light as if I were drifting between consciousness and the unknown. Then, another shift. I was no longer on the ground. Instead, I was being carried. my head resting against something firm. There was a moment when I felt the steady rhythm of a heartbeat, calm, controlled, but fast enough to betray unease. I wanted to ask, "Who are you?" But the question never came. The next time I woke, I was surrounded by the sterile scent of antiseptic. A beeping sound filled the air, methodical, keeping time with my shallow breaths. The sheets beneath my fingertips were crisp, too smooth to be my own. A hospital. The realization sent a sharp wave of unease through me. My fingers instinctively reached for the bandage on my forehead. Tracing the unfamiliar texture, I inhaled slowly, bracing myself, and then turned my head toward the presence I could feel lingering in the room. I didn't need sight to know he was there. Silence stretched between us before he finally spoke. "You're awake." His voice carried the same detached control as before. But now, there was something else beneath it, hesitation. Maybe even guilt. I swallowed against the dryness in my throat. "Who are you?" A pause. Then, "Nathaniel Carter." The name meant nothing to me. But the weight in his voice did. "You hit me." It wasn't a question. Nathaniel exhaled sharply, and for the first time, I heard something slip past his carefully constructed exterior, regret. I did. Another pause. A measured inhale. Then, "I brought you here. Your medical expenses are covered. When you're discharged, I'll make sure you get home safely." There was no warmth in his words. No attempt at comfort. Just facts, presented neatly and efficiently. Something about that made me clench my fists beneath the blanket. I forced myself to sit up, ignoring the pain that rippled through my body. "I don't need your charity." His voice remained unreadable. "It's not charity. It's responsibility." I turned my head slightly, trying to gauge him. People had always been careful around me, either too eager to help or too indifferent to care. But Nathaniel? He was neither, and that unsettled me more than anything else. The hospital room was too quiet. The air between us felt heavy, filled with unspoken thoughts neither of us dared to voice. I could hear the faint rustling of fabric as he shifted in his seat. Could sense the tension in his movements, like a man unaccustomed to uncertainty. Now forced to sit with it, I turned my head slightly in his direction, though my eyes, as always, saw nothing. "You don't have to stay," I murmured, my voice hoarse. Nathaniel didn't respond right away. I imagined him sitting there, jaw clenched, fingers drumming against the polished surface of his expensive watch. He seemed like the type who preferred solutions over conversations, actions over apologies. Then, after what felt like an eternity, he spoke. "You don't have anyone listed as an emergency contact." His words were factual, but there was something beneath them. An observation? A realization? I swallowed. "I manage just fine on my own." Nathaniel exhaled. "You were lying unconscious in the middle of the road. That doesn't exactly scream fine." My fingers tightened around the thin blanket covering me. "It was an accident. An accident that never should have happened," he countered, his voice sharp but controlled. Then, softer, "And yet it did." I wasn't sure what he wanted me to say. That I was struggling? That I had spent my entire life fending for myself in a world that was never designed for people like me? That the idea of relying on someone, even temporarily, was more terrifying than the darkness I lived in every day? No, I couldn't give him that. So instead, I lifted my chin, my voice steady. "I don't need your pity, Mr. Carter." He let out a low sound, almost like a humorless chuckle. "Good," he said, "because I'm not offering it." That caught me off guard. Most people were too eager to pity me, to view me as fragile, as less. But there was no hesitation in Nathaniel's voice. No condescension, just an unnerving, matter-of-fact certainty. Then, he said something that made my breath hitch. "Come with me." I blinked, my fingers freezing against the sheets. "What?" "You need help," he said bluntly. "A stable place to recover." "I can provide that." I shook my head instinctively. "I don't." "This isn't charity," he interrupted. "Think of it as a business arrangement. You get security, stability. I make sure you're not left to struggle alone after what happened." That's it. I could barely process what he was suggesting. The idea was absurd, unbelievable, and yet, a part of me, a small, tired part one hated to acknowledge, whispered, would that really be so bad? I forced myself to scoff. Why would you even care? Nathaniel was silent for a moment before answering. Because I caused this, he said quietly, and I don't walk away from my mistakes. The world had changed around us. Or maybe, we had changed within it. The walls Nathaniel had built to shield himself from vulnerability had crumbled. And the fears I once carried like a second skin had softened into something I never thought possible, trust. As I stood with him beneath the soft glow of the evening sky, I felt the weight of our journey. The battles we had fought, against the past, against ourselves, had led us here. To a place where neither of us had to walk alone. I used to think love was something fragile. I murmured, turning my face towards him. Something easily broken. Nathaniel's fingers brushed against mine. His touch both familiar and grounding. And now? I exhaled, feeling the warmth of him beside me. Now I know it's the strongest thing of all. His hand found mine fully then. Fingers lacing together with a quiet certainty. I don't need to see the world the way others do. I continued, because I see you, and that's enough. Nathaniel gently pulled me closer, pressing his forehead to mine. And I see you, he whispered. In that moment, it didn't matter where we had been, or what lay ahead. What mattered was now, the promise we had made. Not in words, but in the way we held on to each other. Love wasn't about perfection. It wasn't about sight. It was about knowing, deep in your soul, that you had found the one person who would stand beside you. Even in the darkest of nights. And for the first time in my life, I wasn't afraid of the future. I was home. Thank you for watching. Don't forget to subscribe to Life Stories for more heartfelt videos.